Our disability is our greatest strength. It gives us a supervision to see the issues facing humanity from a more inclusive perspective and the grit to fight back against all odds. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the More Than Walking video podcast discussion. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the podcast where people of all abilities gather to discuss pressing issues that affect the disability community and their implications for the world at large. I'm your host, Corey Pheez, C4 complete quadriplegic since 2005, and my co-host, Jonathan Sigworth, who's a C7 quadriplegic since 2006, was not able to join us today, but nonetheless, he is here with us in spirit. We're recording this on Monday, the 12th of January, 2026. So happy New Year's to all of you. And in a little bit, we'll be discussing with some experts about accessible democracy. Who's driving? So just a brief thing I want to make sure I put out there that Super Adaptables has been made possible in part by a grant from the Christopher and Dana Reeves Foundation National Paralysis Resource Center. The information provided and opinions expressed in these podcasts do not necessarily reflect the views of the Christopher and Dana Reeves Foundation. For more information about the Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center, you can visit www.christopherreeve.org. Also, I should note that the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of More Than Walking, but belong to us as individual speakers. So with that, I would like to welcome our first guest speaker, Sylvia Yee. Sylvia is the Public Policy Director at Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, or DREFT, where her work includes projects to increase physical and programmatic accessibility and disability awareness in the delivery of healthcare services, as well as some limited impact litigation to increase access for people with disabilities in a myriad aspects of public and private life. Ms. Yee maintains interest in healthcare reform, public health disparities, disability, and eugenics, and the implementation of cross-disability and cross-civil rights communities. She received her BS, MA, and LLB degrees from the University of Alberta. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you, Corey.
We also have Alexia Kimmerling. She is the Director of Accessible Democracy at AAPD. In this role, she supports the Rev Up Network, building the power of the disability vote from the local to the national level. She also serves as a subject matter expert on disability voting rights and election accessibility. Welcome, Alexia. And show that shirt.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. The shirt I am wearing today says, "Vote, use your power."
I love it. Thank you for that. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge Gretchen Knopf. Gretchen is the Director of the Department of Services for Persons with Disabilities for New Haven, Connecticut. For the past 30 years, she has advocated for the rights of persons with disabilities while holding various positions at the State Office of Protection and Advocacy for Persons with Disabilities, or P&A. Most recently as Assistant Director. She also worked to establish Disability Rights Connecticut and became its first Executive Director. Gretchen has presented on topics that include the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, disability history, assistive technology, and the rights of voters with disabilities. Gretchen is currently a board member of the ADA Coalition of Connecticut, FAVOR, and the State Independent Living Council, SILC, which I'm also a part of. Gretchen is passionate about the civil and human rights of people with disabilities and works towards creating a community with everyone truly belongs, or creating a community. Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Awesome. So what we like to do here is, I love analogies. That's the best way I think people can kind of get a vision of whatever you're dealing with, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through song, or it's just a good movie telling a great story. And so when I think about accessible democracy, I think about it more like a vehicle. So automobiles revolutionized the transportation industry. People could now reach their destination more quickly and more readily. As more people became motorists, each individual's driving experience varied. Though no one likes a backseat driver, the voices of those who come along for the ride are important to heed, as they may offer suggestions or advice on how to reach the destination safely and more efficiently. What if we applied this concept to democracy? Democracy is the car. Politicians may be behind the driver's seat, but the people are both the passengers and the owners of the vehicle. Steering this massive government system isn't easy, with so many twists and turns that present themselves, and sometimes accidents do occur. Distractions like cell phones filled with unvetted news stories promoting misinformation only further compound the issue, and it makes you feel like our political leaders are texting while driving instead of focusing on the road ahead. However, if all occupants in this vehicle we call democracy can learn to carpool rather than be filled with road rage, our roadways would feel a lot safer and easier to navigate. So, with that being said, um, I was reading on the City of New Haven's website, and Gretchen, I know in your bio you talk about having spoken to people and talked to them about the history of disabilities, and so going back to July 26, 1990, the signing of the ADA, which I'm taking this as a quote directly from New Haven's City of New Haven's website, guaranteeing that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to enjoy employment opportunities, purchase goods and services, and participate in state and local government programs. It can't sum it up any better, in my opinion, as to why we need to know more about accessible democracy. So, with that being said, I'd like to open up the first question to you, Gretchen, and Alexia and Sylvia. Please feel free to follow up. But what is accessible democracy? Why is it important, and who benefits or doesn't benefit from it?
When I was reading the questions, I thought it's a huge question. Like, it's just, your car analogy was great, but to me, accessible democracy is not what we're getting now. It's a democracy where no matter who you are and where you are in whatever your journey is, that you are free to express yourself, you are free to participate. I think also accessible democracy means that our voting is open to everyone, that it's not something where we're having to defend this and that in order to open up barriers. I think it's something that we're always going to be working to achieve so that everyone has the same opportunity to be part of this country and the government and their world and their communities. It's the only way we're going to get that.
Absolutely. Sylvia, if you could, what do you think accessible democracy means? Like, what does it mean in that sense?
Yes, I mean, Gretchen made great points, and I definitely agree with them. I mean, at its core, a democracy, is a way of running things, but an accessible democracy is one that gives everyone the chance not only to participate, but to actually change the rules too. That's the strength and the vulnerability of democracy too, that it's always growing, potentially changing depending on who's a citizen, who's in the country, who has something at stake, right? And that's everyone here. And then it requires that we are constantly trying to increase the capacity of everyone who's here, to understand the rules, to get an education, to follow and get good news. There's always this. There's so many ways in which all of that, in which we are threatened as people who have a stake in the country. Some of it we can be threatened because their voting processes are inaccessible, but we're also threatened when our education is uneven, when the chance to get ahead and to live life and make choices is taken away. I think all of that has to do with what is an accessible democracy. Deeply affects people with disabilities, but also people with different characteristics that haven't been historically recognized as valuable in any given country. So,
yeah, that's key. And when you talked about when I think about the term accessible, I don't necessarily automatically jump in to you need a ramp or just assistive technology. I think that's a big portion of it, but I also think about people that live in the rural areas. I think about older adults who are unable to get outside of the house. One statistic I read that about 1 in 4 U.S. adults, which is around 28.7 or percent or 61 million people, have some type of disability, right? And disabilities aren't even just something you are born with, but you acquire over time. And like you said, things change in democracy. And so the people have the ability to weigh in on the situation, or at least we will hope that we have the ability to weigh in on the situation to change things if need be. Alexia, how do you define it?
Yeah, I really love what Gretchen and Sylvia have shared already. And I think Sylvia was really making me think about what power means and what role power plays in democracy. And really, like in a democracy, the people are supposed to have the power, right? And we are supposed to have equal power of one vote being cast. Nobody gets to vote twice on something. But in reality, there are many systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the ballot, both disabled people and other people with marginalized identities. And so there isn't that true access to power. And when we have that imbalance, then elected officials are not truly working for all of this, and we're not able to hold them all accountable. So I think in an accessible democracy, it's both that equal opportunity to participate, that shared power, and really the recognition of people's power by elected officials, and the accountability to them. And I also think about, even just like zooming into a smaller level, many disabled people have limited choices in their lives, right? Like we might have a limited choice of where we can live because of where accessible housing exists. If you live in a congregate setting like a nursing home or a state operated developmental center, because you don't have enough direct care workers, you might not even get to make choices about what time you wake up or what you eat for lunch or where you work. But your right to vote is one choice that nobody can take away from you. And it is something that you get to decide independently. And that is a huge power in an individual's life and in a way that connects them to their community, and to, the broader systems that impact their life. And so I think not only a zoom out power, but it can have a lot of impact in just an individual's life.
I think, all of that is right, except I think the problem is that we are all not even to begin with. So there are people who live in rural communities who don't get news or don't find out what's happening, and their experience and the things that are important to them are not the same things that are important to somebody else. And I find that there are, in Connecticut, even if you have a guardian, you have the right to vote unless the probate court says otherwise. But the problem is, and I've taken the accessible machine around to different places in Connecticut, and people walk by and we'll ask if they want to register to vote. And part of the response we get is, well, their parents won't let them. And this is a problem. This is an issue that, we are now saying this is not right. And how do we fix this? But parents have so much influence and sway. One event we went to, the organization got a phone call from a parent who said, "How dare you do this? Why are you having a voting event?" And it was fun. Secretary of State showed up, took pictures with our Rev Up materials, all of that. But if you're the people who were in the room, they were quizzing them and they knew their stuff. They understood history. So we have to keep working at these problems that we find. So it makes it harder to achieve this accessible democracy because you're always trying to fix those little things that are coming. And it's frustrating.
Yeah, that's huge. So if I could back up a little bit, so during last year we were reading various books. I read a book by a woman named Maria Ressa. She is a Filipino journalist who, she exposed a lot of things under President Duterte's regime, and she's currently like facing, some serious time behind bars if her appeals doesn't go in her favor. And I think about, this idea of owning power or co-equal, having the ability to have power as a citizen, and also with our elected representatives, they hold the power that we are essentially giving them. But it's kind of like once they get to a place on Capitol Hill, part of your General Assembly in your state, they somehow speak broadly about, you know, the American people have spoke. And that's not necessarily true. There's only a portion, or rather your party has really spoken, but that's not every single individual. And so it's really hard to exercise that power, especially as you talk about, like with parents. When I think about from a historical um, standpoint, democracy, began in ancient Greece, and even though it was more direct, where people could congregate at these amphitheaters and vote on particular subjects, not every person that was part of their citizenship was able to vote. You couldn't vote if you were a woman, couldn't vote if you were a slave, couldn't vote if you were child, and you could vote as a citizen as well. And so there's a lot of conflict when it comes down to who's actually holding the power and swaying individuals. If you're a custodian over a child who is 18, but yet they may have, you know, some physical barriers going on or mental barriers going on, you can easily influence that child, or you could say, "No, I don't think you need to do that. That's not for you," or what have you. So that's a really important point. Um, that you make. And I would, also kind of say it's like, who benefits from those types of situations? Is it the parent who just wants their guy or their gal in office? Or is it the people who want to redistrict and they want to gerrymander? Like, who's really trying to benefit from swaying the voters? Which, I think is also an attitudinal question too. Like, you guys are working directly with individuals when it comes down to disability voting rights. What kind of barriers are you seeing people face from an attitudinal standpoint, and what do you think can be done to kind of deconstruct people's mindset from stereotyping individuals with disabilities?
I This is Sylvia, and
Yeah.
I think that I think that the who actually benefits is kind of a tough question in some ways. I mean, parents who have so much influence over their children likely also have influence over what the children believe and who they might vote for, right? So it's in a way you could argue, well, wouldn't you want your child with a disability to vote, and then they'll just get another vote for what you want as a parent, right? But there's even more core, I think, in what Gretchen was getting at, this idea of like it becomes less a right and more like who is worthy, right? This gatekeeping,
Mm.
who will exercise their decision wisely and smartly and reasonably, as if all of us always vote smartly and reasonably and wisely, right? And it's just that, and I think there's always people with disabilities have always had this stereotype of you don't have the capacity to vote, especially people with developmental or intellectual disabilities. Is kind of you're not forming your own decision, um, or you're using the wrong kind of criteria, so you don't really get to vote, or you're not intelligent enough, you're not smart enough, you're not something enough to vote. Um, and I think that sort of the best way to really try to fight some of that is the actual witness of people with disabilities. The experience of voting yourself, as a person with all kinds of disabilities, to really I mean, that's what's important to deconstruct. I also think that there would be incredible power from like bipartisan sort of outreach and writing experiences of people with disabilities who are like, what's key is that I got the right to vote, that I exercise the right to vote. It isn't what or who I voted for necessarily, but that I used my right, and this person who may well have voted differently also used their right. And this idea, like there really is value to democracy and to letting people vote
Mm.
individually, not necessarily without assistance, but to letting them make their own choice and recognizing that the capacity to make choice is a broad one. Many, many people have it, whether they think the same way that you do or not, whether they write the tests the same way, whether they have a certain IQ or not. It's more fundamental than that.
Understood. Lexia, what are you seeing?
Yeah, reflecting on Gretchen saying, "Oh, these are some big questions." I like it, Corey. Diving deep. I think one thing I think about a lot is, it's easy to get in this back and forth of like proving someone's worth or value or capacity, but point blank, like they have the right. And I think like using the legal language and reminding parents, reminding nursing home staff that not only do people with disabilities have the right to vote, but people who are in those positions of power have the responsibility to make sure that a person can act on their right to vote if they want to. And all they need to do is express interest in doing that. There is, a lot of legal guidance already on that. And we've had that battle. And sometimes it's just point blank reminding people. But it is really startling how prevalent that ableism is. In 2024, I did a project with one of our state coalitions, Rev Up Texas, where we recruited students with disabilities to be poll workers. And we did it at a community college that is a post-secondary inclusive education program. So it's all students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. One of the things I really see as moving towards a more accessible democracy is having more disabled people working the elections process, whether that's being a poll worker, to working in Secretary of State's office, to being an elected official. We need to be there at every level. But, we were working on this program with this community college, and a person that had pretty high seniority in the college directly asked me, are we allowed to recruit these students to be poll workers? Are these people even allowed to vote? So even at like a high level of education in a setting where they are working with this population, this ableism still persists. And another one of we work with a really wonderful group of advocates in New York, Self-Advocates of New York State. And one of their main Get Out the Vote projects every single year is giving self-advocates a template for how to talk to their caregivers and parents about voting. And so I think it's incredibly frustrating that this is still a battle, and it's about, just continuing to assert the right and also continuing to connect disabled people to each other and to community so that they can find that peer support and that power, and, feel less isolated in that.
Wow, you're making a good point, Gretchen. Before you weigh in on that question, I think the ableism or the ableistic attitude is probably chiefly. I think we have a inflated sense of self-worth sometimes because early on in my relationship, before I and my wife were married, I can remember going to just a Wednesday night like Bible study, and a guy looked at my wife or fiance at the time, and he goes, "Are you at work?" Simply because she's with a guy with a wheelchair, right? And then she just was like, "No, this is my fiance." Oh, I'm sorry. So there's this kind of like bias in individuals without even realizing, like you said, some of those people at the highest levels who should be educated would know some of these things, or at least to stay away from it, especially if you're running for public office where you're trying to garner support from all corners of your district, right? And I think, I don't know if you ladies have heard of a gentleman by the name of Ethan Hollander. He's an associate professor of political science at McLean McTurman Arnold Research Scholar at Wabash College. He has this fascinating book I've been reading about democracy and its alternatives, and it's just various lectures. But he talks about, he speaks on voter ignorance, but I'm surprised he didn't really touch on politician ignorance, right? So on one end, you have voter ignorance where there are people who, they lack the knowledge among like the general public about basic facts concerning like structure of government, how it functions, specific policies, and they are citizens, they're American as quote unquote apple pie, and yet they go poll and they vote and they don't know what the issue is, right? So when you talk about like what kind of intelligent level, yeah, you have individuals with disabilities of varying degrees who know a whole lot about the subject at hand and are able to make informed decisions and can teach you a little bit of something. And last podcast during our group forum, we talked about that voter ignorance and also voter apathy, which is that lack of interest in participating because you see that, okay, does my vote even count because I am disabled? And if you're looking at me like that, I don't think you'd really take me seriously. But yeah, Gretchen, if you could weigh in about the attitudinal barriers that you saw, we kind of like touched a little bit too on the provisions. So if you could lead into like, different type of provisions that people with disabilities should take or be aware of to be a part of the voting process.
Well, there are about 20 things I thought of while you were all talking. Alexia, I am such an advocate for people being poll workers, people with disabilities being poll workers. I think it's the way that we change attitudes is by showing up and being a part of our community and having people understand who we are. And, that just like everybody else, we have our ups, our downs, our likes, our dislikes, the things we know about, the things we don't. I have a sister with an intellectual disability. She is a poll worker. That is her best day of the year. She just absolutely loves it. She calls me and says, "Are you going to take me at 5 a.m?" And I go, "Do I have to?" She says, "Yes." So I get up and I take her at 5 a.m. But she's educated people around her about who she is. The other thing that I thought of, and she also calls me and tells me things, and she's very politically aware, and she has some very strong opinions about things because she absorbs them. So you can't say that people, just because they have one type of disability or another, that they don't get it. Because how many people do you know who are influenced by what their parents have said? I have a friend, she has no disability, and she votes a certain way that I don't agree with for reasons that have nothing to do with how we care about our world. And, that's a difficult thing. But then we turn around and we say to people with disabilities, you don't have the ability to vote. Well, one of the things, like, parents just don't think their kids have that ability. It's just interesting to me because I heard the phrase that people with disabilities are subjected to the soft discrimination of low expectation. And that has always carried with me because I think it's true. We don't expect that people with disabilities can do things. Look at rate of employment. There are so many other things. So we have to change attitude, improve things by making opportunities, by hiring people with disabilities, by making sure they get out to vote, by taking away the barriers, all the things that, basically we've been working for a long time, right, ladies, and they continue to happen. And if people with disabilities would understand that if they all got together and voted in a block, we'd change America. We would totally change America. And I believe that. But there are so many things that get in the way, even just to the polling place. Do you have that step up? Are we doing curbside voting, which may not be great because we haven't made our polling place accessible, which is wholly unacceptable. You want to get me going? Let's start there.
Sure.
We have people with disabilities and we tell them, we don't have mail-in voting in Connecticut, but we tell people mail in your ballot or put it in your ballot box or have somebody, you drive there and somebody does that. But when that happens, nobody sees that there's a person with a disability who cared to vote. There are just so many things that happen with that. Do people understand the ID requirements and how to get an ID? And is requiring you to go and pay to get an ID because the only way you can get it in your state is by going to get a non-driver ID at your DMV or motor vehicle, whatever you call it. And people don't have that money. Just all of these things that stand in the way. If you can't get an ID, then one should be provided for you somehow. For anybody, if you want to walk in, make it part of government. They're just, you could go on and on and on about all of these things. It's just amazing to me what we could learn if we just opened ourselves up and made things accessible and available to everybody. Attitudes would change.
Yes. Go ahead, Sylvia. Thank you for that.
Just adding on to what Gretchen was saying, the cycle is so bad, right? Because the more you have barriers to begin with, the less you see, the harder it is, right, for people to get out. And the less you see them, the less you think there are other people with disabilities who are voting, right? And the worst attitudinal barrier is when a person with a disability absorbs for themselves the thought that they can't vote, they're not able to do this, they're not worthy of the right, or they're not able to do it, or it's just too much trouble. That sort of self-belief is the hardest to overcome. And and the less you see people like yourself, right, voting and participating in society, the more you believe that. What are the differences? Having done a little bit of international work, like Japan has laws about accessibility, and you can have like new subways that are accessible, but it doesn't mean you see people with disabilities in the streets in Japan. And there is still, in many Asian cultures, this sense of like, oh no, people with disabilities, we just keep them at home. It's a family secret. That's hard to overcome in many societies. I think we've come a long ways in the US to overcome that. And we should be at a point where we're building on overcoming that even more rather than falling backwards.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Going back to something Gretchen said, yeah, I can remember just going to AAA and trying to make sure, let me go there very early just to even get my license when I was, on my feet. Now, when it comes down to having to go to the DMV or go to my local high school to vote, I say to myself, man, it's cold. I don't feel like being out there. It was nice this past election. I was in my car and people just came out to the car and then fill out the paperwork and then brought, submitted my ballot that way. That was nice, but still, I had to get in my car with my kids, pack them all up, and do it. I personally would love, and I know it would be a question about like security because we're already have this idea that there's such widespread voting fraud and what have you that we got to do it only one way. But when you have a disability, I think you should be able to vote online. There's a lot of activity that you typically do online. You should get a code that's generated, that it's a one-time code. You can't get it anywhere else. And you should be able to vote for the people that you want. And you submit it to your local principality, and it's done like that. That would have more participation. But going back to something you said, Sylvia, about just in other countries, and I didn't realize this until I was reading the book about democracy and its alternatives, that there's compulsory voting, that there are countries that they force you to vote. Granted, it overinflates the voter turnout when you're like, oh yeah, 90% of people voted and what have you. And obviously, they're of age to vote, but not everybody is registered per se. So you don't really get a good feel on it. But it begs the question, does that allow everyone to fully participate? Because you might get a fine if you don't go out there and vote. But it was just an interesting thing that Ethan in his book that he covered. But yeah, those are some good ways to get more people involved, like the curbside, just greeting people like that and really, kind of creating a grassroots movement to inform people. And you guys work, do you know if there's any like global government initiatives that the United States could adopt to increase and encourage voter participation? Like, what can we look at another country? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Sweden has like compulsory voting laws. And I've, heard, President Trump mention, like, why can't we be more like Norway or Sweden or all these other countries, but fails to say, like, okay, they may run their government in a way that is not so conducive to your particular party. But what are some global government initiatives that maybe we could adopt that, could help increase voter participation?
Most of my expertise, all of my expertise, is US based. I've not done any international work, but one thing that I think a lot about when we compare policies to other countries is just the United States is geographically gigantic and geographically and population wise very diverse. And there are many times where I feel so frustrated by how different the state voting laws are in every state. It makes it really challenging. It makes it unequal, especially in states where we see a lot of voter suppression and a deep history of voter suppression. But then there are some states where I understand, like, the geographic differences. They need to set the own ways that they vote, right? Like in Arizona, where you have huge canyons and mountains, right? Like the way it's not possible, or states that have huge areas of rural countries, it's not possible to have a physical polling place that's close enough to where those folks live. So emphasis on mail voting needs to be important. But when I'm thinking about just general provisions, not drawing from any international knowledge here, but general provisions that make voting more accessible, I think having a lot of days open for early in-person voting, having no excuse mail voting, everyone should be able to vote by mail if they want to. I personally am a proponent for electronic ballot delivery and return, and we are at AAPD as well. It is the only way to make absentee voting fully accessible. And 13 states do allow for electronic ballot delivery and return for disabled voters. More than that allows for it for uniformed overseas voters, and even astronauts who are US citizens can vote electronically from the space station. So I think it is possible to figure out a way to do it securely and safely. These are some of the things that I think about. I'll pass to Gretchen or Sylvia if either of you have any international inspiration to draw on or other thoughts.
I don't really have any international. I mean, my understanding is that voting in other countries is considered so important, like you wouldn't not want to go vote. But I don't know how they educate or inspire people to do that. And it may be, what Alexi is talking about, in the fact that we're a huge country and we're extremely diverse in, where we live and how we live and the information that we get. And, it's, I think that makes a big difference. I just, I think that although our states are different, that we need to keep looking at ways that we can increase voter turnout. I think one of the things is educating people on how voting works. Like sometimes it's just that people are afraid to go out and vote because they've never done it. That's why I take the accessible, to ballot marking device, and I go, and anybody wants to try it. I lose my voice by the end of the day, but people get to we have a fake famous names ballot. So, it's like Benjamin Franklin and all that. And people get to try it. And some people are like, oh, this was really easy. And it's like, yeah, it was really easy. And, one year we took the machine and we did the People First of Connecticut, the self-advocacy group for the state. We did their election and by ballot. We had the company set it up for us, and the Secretary of State's office helped. And a lot of the comments I heard were, wow, this wasn't hard, and we didn't make people, put it through a machine. If they wanted to fill in the dots, they could do that. But that's how they elected their officers. So it had a real life, application. And I think, it helped get some people out to vote. I'll go and talk to any groups about voting, and actually going to talk about that on Thursday, because I just think it's so important. It is, to me, the most fundamental thing you can do as an American is to go out and vote, and to not let anybody tell you that your vote doesn't matter. And I think that what we need to do is help people with disabilities understand that their vote does matter. And even though those microaggressions keep coming, we need to build that up and say, you do matter, because there are elections that are won by one vote, and it could be yours. We had a project called Everyone Counts, about 25 years ago. We did it I was working for the P&A, and we did it under assistive technology. But it had examples in Connecticut about where people won by one vote. Like, it matters. And so giving people opportunities to know and to understand. And my last comment is, I think one of the problems we have in Connecticut is that a lot of the people who are registrars are a lot older, and they have a very paternalistic view. I was with somebody who worked on a project with me. She used a wheelchair. Woman was actually about 6 feet 6 inches tall if she stood up, which she could do. But this one registrar came up and patted her on the head. And we were both stunned. So I looked at her and she looked at me, and we still, 20 years later, talk about that. It's like, no, that's not what you do. But so it's all still there. And unless we get people out and we get them working and we get them voting, like, Corey, you went, and I'm glad you got to vote that way, but people didn't get to see you go in your polling place to vote, and I understand. I'd rather have you vote than not vote. But if you can go in and do that, and ask to use the accessible machine.
Yeah, absolutely. That was just that one time. Typically, I would go into the high school and vote, which, if I'm being honest, they're very accommodating. I think it was during the 2020 election. The line was like, gosh,
Mm-hmm.
30 yards long, and it was cold. But they waved me in. They said, no, come up to the front and what have you. So I was able to go into the front, show my ID and stuff like that. And I was able to vote. So, Bloomfield did a very good job with that. It was just this time around, I was like, man, if I could just open up, log in somewhere, that'd be good. But, to your point, it's to see somebody like you making the effort, taking the strides, and what have you, because that helps to change the mindset of those, especially when elections happen. There's usually politicians standing outside of the polling place, and you get the time to engage with them as much as you can about the particular issue at hand. I just want to correct something for the record. It wasn't Sweden, but there is a list. It's about 22 countries. I won't name all of them with compulsory voting, but like places like Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, DR, Ecuador, other places like that have compulsory voting. But just wanted to make sure I correct that for the record. Sylvia, I didn't know if you had anything to add on as far as like global initiatives. If you don't, we can move on.
Um, I put something into the chat that talks about there's an international foundation for electoral systems that works in different countries, and it has guidelines on best practices for voting, for inclusive voting for people with disabilities. The question of whether the U.S. could or would adapt some of these. I mean, the U.S. doesn't have a great record on paying much attention to what happens in international law or international standards. The recent interview that our president gave to New York Times indicated that he doesn't, his respect level for international law. What is annoying to me personally is how much, and this could be either party, and we have two main parties in the US, and they focus so much on how to get an advantage. And instead of really looking at how do we make voting inclusive? How do we make sure to include everyone and make sure every voice, every person has and uses their vote? It becomes much more about how do we turn this to the advantage of my party so that my people can vote and the other people don't get to vote. And I feel that that would be something that would be used, in adopting other countries. Other countries' voting practices, some of which could be very good, but they wouldn't be adopted without being sure that it's going to advantage a specific party. We'll adopt Denmark's vaccine vaccination schedule, but we also want Greenland, and we also won't pay attention to other things that Denmark might do. It's just very selective. I'll put it that way.
But we also don't take into consideration how those countries are different. And when we accept their things, it's like, is that really a good thing to do for the American people?
Yes, absolutely. A very, very important point, too. I mean, Denmark has universal health care. Does that have an impact? I think so.
Sure.
Yeah. Skipping around a little bit, when I think about like impact, right? So like we all know that it seems like almost trending that most people tune into the presidential elections, every 4 years, but they ignore what happens in between. How important is it for us to also concentrate on local, state, and federal elections at all time? Like, what's really at stake? And I think about it like, Sylvia, you guys are on the West Coast. Are you like, man, the mayor of New York, that's important? Or are you like, man, I got to focus on things that happen maybe in Sacramento or, I'm not specific. I think you guys, I don't know if you are in California, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So like, are you like, how important is it for people to be engaging at those levels before they can focus on just the overall, overall what's going on like in elections as far as like, federal elections are concerned?
Sure. I think, our sort of local representatives and our local and state voting practices are really important. I mean, we saw how important they were to maintaining what I believe was a fair election in 2020. This kind of, I think it's also important to really for people to think about what is really affecting their life right now. If your kids are in school district decisions are important. You want to vote in those. If you care about unhoused issues, then local, municipal, and county bylaws make a big difference. If your state makes key decisions about how Medicaid operates and the availability of home and community-based services, then it's really important to be involved in state elections. And the congressional elections every 2 years signal our agreement or our disagreement as citizens with a mandate claimed by a president. I mean, I think all of these build something. They build. We can see now that who our president is makes a big difference. But the degree to which American voters allow him to create, or her, to create a complete sort of yes man environment without opposition is something that's determined over time, not just in a single election. If we value the checks and balances, if we believe in them and believe in a federal system and a constitutional system, then it's all the other elections that help build that protective wall. I know, and it's hard. Life is happening. You can't. It seems like you have to be paying attention to elections and to voting issues like every 2 months, right? It's like a lot is happening around you, but these are really the decisions that affect your life. And if you have to prioritize, you prioritize, but it isn't necessarily the presidential election that's the only important one.
Yeah, and sometimes I think we just get swept up in it, right, Gretchen?
So much money in that one.
Oh gosh,
Right?
that's a conversation for another day.
Well, yeah, we need to have some kind of reins pulled in on the amount of money that can be spent because, and you're talking about elections and local and your board of ed, your town. Like I live in a small town, so we have a select person, and how they handle the things that go on can affect how you live in your town. Everything from picking up your garbage to how animal control works, and that's your like immediate need. But then you start looking statewide and how are different states dealing with some of the things that are happening? Are they, did your elected leaders, fight some of the things that are happening? Like, that we're not feeding our kids because we've lost funding for that, and are we fighting that, or are we trying to figure out how we might feed our kids? And both of those are really important. And, in Connecticut, we've reacted sort of on both sides of that. And that's just, an example. There's so many other things that are happening, and then you look at Wisconsin, how that the election there was sort of influenced by how much money there was and how important it was. Same thing with the three judges, Supreme Court judges in Pennsylvania, and how are their decisions going to, influence what happens in the state of Pennsylvania. And then, who's your governor, and what does that governor stand for? And there are a lot of governors who are changing, the pieces of the chessboard this year, and there are a lot of representatives who are leaving. So taking a look at that, and how is that going to influence what happens? And then, there are rumors that we're not going to have midterm elections. And how do we deal with that now? And how do we call on our representatives and even, in our state and our federal, our attorneys general, to deal with those things? So you really have to be, you don't have to be an expert on everything, but you should be aware about things that are going on in almost every level of your life. And the problem is that some people don't have access to that. There are people who have 2, 3, 4 jobs. And just to get through the day is enough to not, there isn't even time to sit down, because if you do, you're falling asleep and you're not absorbing what's happening on the news. So it's all really important. We do candidates forum every other year, and we invite people to come. It's nonpartisan, but we want people to be educated about who they're going to be voting for. We ask them specifically disability-related questions, and you get some really interesting responses from people that they've never considered people with disabilities. We've had candidates who go, well, what do you all think in the crowd? And it's like, no, we're here for you to, oh yeah, it's really interesting. But so, I'm just rambling on and on, but the thing for me is, election for the president of a high school class is as important as president, of the United States, in its own way, in its own microcosm of what it creates.
That is well said. Lexia, you want to weigh in before we close?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the points Sylvia made about specific elected officials that make decisions that impact disabled people. And I really love Gretchen naming that it is so important, and also it is so difficult, and people have a lot going on in their lives. And also, it unfortunately is a lot easier to get information about federal elections and federal candidates than it is local elections and local candidates. And at every level, there are issues with campaigns being inaccessible. But it's more prevalent at the local level because of, the disparity in money that's available. But, for example, like where I live, we last fall had a city council race, and the main way to get information on those candidates was to go to in-person events that did not have ASL interpreters or CART or multi-language interpretations, even though we have lots of languages represented in our community, right? And there was, of course, maybe 1 to 3 articles in local news about these candidates, but it is difficult to get that information. And yeah, so I'm so glad that there are coalitions and organizations like Rev Up Connecticut that are doing these nonpartisan disability candidate forums. And I hope to see a lot more of that engagement and accessible campaigning. And if any candidates are watching this podcast, I hope that they will make their campaign accessible to the over 40 million disabled voters in the United States.
That'd be brilliant.
Yeah, it would. You oftentimes, or at least in my experience, when I hear about what a candidate is doing, is usually a general thing that does not necessarily fit for all of us that's involved. It might be just, on the core 7 things that people are maybe concerned about that they did a Pew Research poll on. It could be everything from, immigration, abortion, um, our handling of the president or lawmakers handling of the economy. But then you'll hear those small little things that make the biggest difference. I fought for getting the sidewalks uh, changed. I fought for this area to be widened in the town hall. I fought to get this elevator installed. And those are the things that make a big difference for people like myself with mobility issues. Like, I'm 6'2", 250. Like, I'm not a small person, and my chair is just as large as me. And so, like, when I go into places, I think about all of that, even from the private sector. Like, I go into a mall and I can't stand there. I'm just like, why are all the racks in the middle like this? I'm going to take somebody's polo sweater off of the rack. I'm tearing up everything, and it sucks. And I'm just like, who do I have to speak to? And I'll use this example as in closing. But I went into like a TJ Maxx in I want to say it's like Canton, Connecticut. So it's right around the corner from where I am here in Bloomfield. And I spoke to one of the employees. I said, "Man, when are y'all gonna get an electronic door? Like, I need somebody to hold it open. Even when people coming into the store, they usually are so busy on their phone they don't hold the door open. And there's obviously no handicap. But I went in there 3 months later. It was an electronic door. No one said
Yeah,
anything. They didn't ask my
yeah,
name, but that conversation I had, I like literally 3 months later, and there was an electronic door, and it made me feel good because I felt my voice was heard. Somebody took it seriously, like, man, yeah, he's right. Something
yeah,
needs to change about all of that, right? And so it's those little things that make, I think, politics in general, because politics is really all about us coming together, trying to make a decision that's going to benefit the masses. And that's it. We have to learn to have that type of conversation, and it should not be partisan. I don't care if you're red, blue, or purple. I don't care about that stuff. I care about what you can do as a manager. You're only there temporarily. You're
right.
not gonna be there for the rest of your life. I mean, granted, maybe there should be some term limits, but like, eventually you're
Maybe.
gonna leave.
Yeah.
You're gonna go. And you just need to manage properly. Um, and so, this has been such a great discussion. I want to close it with a combination of both what I found on Dref's website as well as Rev's Up website that I think summarizes what we're looking for in accessible democracy. And, the statement I'm pulling is we envision a just world where all people with and without disabilities live full, joyful, pleasurable lives free of discrimination and oppression. And when you talk about the 40 million eligible voters with disabilities, voting, is so key. It's a way to live a self-determined life by influencing the people and policies that affect your everyday life, and your vote can help create positive change. And I believe in that. And I hope that when uh, politicians and other individuals watch this podcast, they'll be empowered by the knowledge that in the work that all three of you ladies are doing to help people like me. You're dealing with folks with disabilities, your family members, you're experiencing it on the ground, and that should also help take the prejudice away from people with disabilities who look at able-bodied people and just go, man, they don't know what I'm going through. They don't understand, but you three are all doing the work, and I'm very, very grateful that you guys came on to talk about this very important issue. I really appreciate that.
Thank you
But
for
with
having this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's
no
such a
Not
problem.
pleasure.
just this session, so many.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
such a
you and
pleasure to talk
Jonathan
with you.
rock.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah,
Hey,
again, thank
Tina.
you.
Sorry,
Yes,
I've met Tina a long time ago. I don't know if she remembers
thank
me,
you.
but
Meta through email. So thank you for participating in this Morning Walking video podcast discussion. Stay tuned and sign up for the Morning Walking newsletter at morningwalking.com to learn about the topic we will cover next and how you can participate. Also, like, comment, and subscribe to our More Than Walking YouTube channel to watch each podcast and click that notification bell so that you're alerted when new episodes drop. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for More Than Walking or Super Adaptables. Until then, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else, keep adapting.